What if everything you believed about love was just the memory of something that never happened? What if every beat of your heart echoed a promise made centuries ago, forgotten between walls covered in dust and silence? And what if, when opening an old letter, you didn't just find but yourself, written in lines that time refused to erase? There are places that don't belong to the world of the living or the dead. Places where the wind seems to whisper names no one dares to repeat. Where the scent of aged wood blends with the faint perfume of flowers that no longer exist. It was in one of those places that everything began, or maybe that's where it all ended. That foggy morning, the sky seemed to press down on the mountains. The distant sound of the sea mixed with the rustling of old trees that lined the path. Paul, a man who thought he'd forgotten how to feel, walked along the dirt road leading to the abandoned Duarte mansion. A grand house built in the 19th century, with tall windows and a weary soul. They said time stopped there. That mirrors didn't just reflect faces but also the memories of those who dared to stay too long. He didn't know exactly what drew him to that place. Maybe it was the distant inheritance of a relative he'd never met. Or maybe it was just the simple urge to start over, to escape the urban life that had drained him with its routines and emptiness. But as the mansion came into view, huge, dark, silent, something inside him began to stir. An ancient, almost familiar feeling, as if every step toward that iron gate was also a step inward, into himself. The gate groaned as he pushed it open, letting out a deep, hoarse sound, like a sigh from the other side of time. The garden was overrun with ivy, and the moss-covered statues seemed to watch him with hollow eyes. The air was thick, the smell of rain mixed with rust and dead leaves. And there, standing before the main entrance, he felt for the first time the invisible weight of something he couldn't name, a premonition maybe, or the cold touch of a forgotten presence. When he crossed the threshold, the sound of the outside world vanished. Inside the mansion, time had its own rhythm. Dust particles danced in the faint light filtering through stained glass. The wooden floor creaked under his steps, and the air smelled of stories no one told anymore. Sheets covered the paintings, the furniture was worn, the clocks were frozen. Every object seemed to hide a secret, and amid all that, a strange harmony. The silence felt almost welcoming, like the embrace of a house that had waited too long to be remembered. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling like he was trespassing on something sacred. With every step, the mansion seemed to be watching him. At the end of the hallway upstairs, a half-open door let out a soft breeze, carrying an old scent, jasmine and paper. When he pushed it open, he found a room bathed in gentle light, as if the sun had forgotten to leave. In the center, on a pale wooden desk, rested a small box of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. His heart began to race for no clear reason. There was something about it, something that called to him, insistent and irresistible. The letters seemed to pulse under the light as if they were alive, as if they had waited for this exact moment to be found. And then, before touching them, he asked himself, maybe for the last time, if he really wanted to know what fate had left there for him. And there are letters that should never be opened, but he did, and that's how the story began, or was reborn. Between lines written in faded ink, he found the first whisper of a love time had tried to erase. And without realizing it, as he read the first letter, Paul began to be read too. By the house, by the past, by something that had been waiting for him all along. For days, Paul explored every corner of the old mansion, as if walking through the ruins of his own soul. The wind blew through the broken windows, and the sound of his footsteps echoed from some distant time. It was as if every room held an emotion, a fragment of life refusing to disappear. He discovered portraits hanging along the narrow corridors, faces faded, eyes that seemed to follow him. Some showed smiling couples, others lonely figures wrapped in shadows. Yet all of them shared the same look, the look of those who once loved too deeply and lost what could never be replaced. The whole mansion breathed a heavy melancholy, as if even the air had been steeped in longing. The letters now lay on the desk, free of dust and carefully arranged. There were many, maybe 50, maybe more. all handwritten, in an elegant, almost painfully beautiful script. There were no names on the outside, only dates, some so old they seemed to belong to another century. He picked one at random. The yellowed paper carried a faint scent, the same jasmine that lingered in the room. When he opened it, the words struck him like a memory that wasn't his, yet had always lived somewhere within him. It spoke of love, but not an ordinary love. It was a love that seemed to defy death itself. The letter described the sound of rain against stained glass, the touch of hands that never let go, the promise of a reunion when time would once again bow to the heart. Each sentence carried the weight of a secret and the lightness of a goodbye. He didn't know who had written it or to whom, but he felt, with an almost physical certainty, that those words knew him. It was as if the text was speaking with him, not to him, as if there was an invisible thread binding Paul to the story within. In the days that followed, time began to lose its shape. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Dawn and dusk blurred together, and the mansion seemed to breathe along with him, sighing in the winds, creaking in the floors, whispering through the mirrors. At night, he heard soft footsteps coming from the hallway, but when he rose to look, everything returned to absolute silence. He began to feel he wasn't alone, not in a threatening way. On the contrary, it was a calm, watchful presence, an invisible companion that seemed to walk beside him, protecting him or perhaps studying him. Sometimes he spoke softly into the emptiness. Who wrote these letters? But silence answered with the gentleness of a breeze, and the faint tremor of the curtains felt like a wave, or a warning. One afternoon, as he looked out into the garden through the dusty, stained glass, he saw something move, a feminine silhouette dressed in white walking among the ivy. The figure seemed ethereal, almost translucent, as if the sunlight itself was dissolving around her. For a moment, he believed the impossible. The woman turned her face, and her eyes, calm and infinite, pierced through both time and glass. He blinked, and she was gone. Paul stood frozen for long minutes, heart racing, hands cold. There was something familiar about that vision, a strange recognition, as if he had once loved her, dreamed her, lost her. And so, he returned to the letters, as if somewhere within them he could find an answer. In one, dated 1892, there was a single line that made him shiver. If someone ever finds these words, they'll know that love never ends. It only changes form. After that, he couldn't stop reading. Each letter was a confession, an echo of intertwined lives, separated by tragedy and promise. The same woman appeared again and again, her name written in delicate handwriting, Ilara, Ilara. The name sounded like a whisper, like a prayer, and with every repetition, something inside him began to awaken, a nearly forgotten memory, an ancient feeling blooming again in the dark. That night, by the faint light of a candle, he had the first dream. He dreamed of the mansion alive, full of voices and music. He dreamed of laughter, of footsteps dancing across the hall, of the warm touch of a hand on his. And in the middle of the dance, her face, Ilara, smiling as if she had known him forever. When he woke, the room was wrapped in cold and silence. But on the desk, there was a new letter, one he had never seen before. And on it, the date was today. The letter dated that very day lay on the desk like a heartbeat outside the body. Steady, soft, impossible to ignore. The paper looked newer than the others, yet it carried the same ancient scent that clung to the room. Jasmine and centuries of dust, as if time itself had a fragrance. The handwriting was the same, like a breath held between lines, tilted, firm, beautiful in its restraint. There was something alive in that script, something that refused indifference. When Paul touched the page, a shiver climbed his skin, like invisible fingers tracing the back of his neck. The candlelight flickered, casting restless shadows on the wall, and for a brief moment the mansion seemed to recoil, like some ancient creature recognizing the gesture of being touched. He examined the edges, The texture of the ink, the faint ripple in the fibers of the paper. There were no erasures, no signs it had been brought from elsewhere. It was as if the letter had simply materialized between one blink and the next, summoned by a memory that didn't remember being one. The letter spoke of the sound of silent clocks, as if silence itself could measure time. It described the dusty stained glass, the light caught on furniture, the night wind slipping through the cracks, lifting the curtains gently. Details far too specific, too present, too close to what he himself was experiencing there, that very night. The words, so carefully arranged, turned the room into a page, and him into a reader who was also part of the text. At the end there was a short line, written as if to close a circle. The things that exist in the dark don't seek to scare us. They only wish to be seen. Paul read those words again and again until the letters melted into liquid outlines, as though the ink were dissolving in the candlelight. He placed the letter beside the others, but the gesture didn't dissolve the feeling of closeness. The room seemed to narrow its walls, lower its ceiling, swallow the air in whispers, and still, there was no fear, only recognition, a cautious tenderness before the impossible. In the days that followed, his routine began to take on the texture of a ritual. In the mornings, he walked through the long corridors, running his hands along the walls, searching for reliefs, cracks, signs of a hidden passage. The wood returned a slow warmth, as if it absorbed human presence only to give it back in the form of memory. Downstairs, the old ballroom held the outlines of steps that no longer existed. The floor, worn in arcs and ellipses, seemed to preserve an invisible choreography. Paul walked along those paths feeling guided by a rhythm, a music only he could hear. In the afternoons he stayed by the desk, cataloging the letters, trying to find an order that made sense. He sorted them by date, then by recurring themes, then by mentions of places and people. Ilara's name kept appearing, like a magnet pulling together everything scattered. There were also references to an inner courtyard, a stone bench beneath a fig tree, and a fountain whose water had stopped flowing long before the last century ended. Small clues, gathered like breadcrumbs through pages and decades. At night, the dreams returned. They weren't nightmares nor peaceful visions, but something in between, a mix of reverence and unrest. The mansion came alive in saturated images. The chandelier lit, the polished wood reflecting glimmers, the scent of ripe fruit and warm wax in the air. One night, Paul dreamed of his own handwriting, but the handwriting wasn't his. In the dream, the pen seemed to choose the words, and the paper, thirsty, drank the ink with quiet pleasure. When he awoke, his fingers tingled with the sensation of holding something he hadn't held, a faint shadow on his fingertip, like a trace of ink that wasn't there. As time passed, small misalignments began to appear. The candelabrum shifted position from one day to the next. The curtain, once tied back, now hung loose as if someone had peeked into the garden during the night. Once he found a thread of white fabric on the carpet, so fine it barely deserved the name. He folded it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its softness spark through his skin. That fragment belonged to none of his things. It had a purity of texture that reminded him of the dress the woman wore among the ivy. On the day the sunlight seemed to dissolve her, Paul began visiting the inner courtyard. He first had to move a heavy piece of furniture that blocked a green-stained glass door. As he pushed, he felt his strength return like a muted echo, as if the wood resisted out of principle, preferring oblivion. Beyond it, a narrow passage led to a walled space. The ground was covered with damp old leaves, releasing a sweet scent of decay. The fig tree still stood there, twisted and majestic, embracing the stones as though to protect them. The bench, moss-stained, waited without impatience, like all things that no longer know how to measure time. Sitting down, Paul felt that this courtyard condensed the essence of the house. The light was denser here, filtered through leaves. The sounds of the outside world arrived softened like sweetened memories. There was a silence that wasn't absence, but a paused kind of presence. He closed his eyes and noticed his heartbeat sinking with the breeze. Then suddenly a thought crystallized. Someone had waited there for a long time. Someone who had counted the same leaves, listened to the same wind, and written in an invisible notebook the way the shadows changed throughout the day. When he returned to the room of letters, he found another page that hadn't been there that morning. The date was the same, and the handwriting identical. It was impossible to deny the convergence. The text described the courtyard with precision and tenderness, the bench marked by years of waiting, the fig tree that seemed to embrace the house as one who forgives. The final note, however, contained a subtle variation. It spoke of the presence of someone who had learned to listen. Paul read and reread those lines with the strange feeling that the mansion, through the letter, was writing about him, as if he were the subject of an old observation finally reaching maturity. From that day on, the thread between what he lived and what he read grew disturbingly tight. The warmth of a late afternoon appeared transcribed in tepid adjectives. The strong winds that whistled through the halls took, in the letters, the form of a patient warning. There were also sentences that seemed to move diagonally, as if each one carried, beyond its surface meaning, a second layer of reading, deeper and more intimate. The word destiny appeared and vanished, sometimes as a promise, sometimes as a threat. And with it, often the name Ilara, unexplained, like a seal. As he read, Paul realized his body was beginning to respond differently to the house. The scent of old wood had become familiar, almost affectionate. The dust in the air moved in a predictable ballet, and the creak of the floor no longer startled him. In exchange, new zones of strangeness emerged, where indifference once lived. Certain mirrors seemed to hold too much light, as though reflecting another room just beyond sight. In one particularly narrow corridor, the cold thickened, and there, only there, his breath came out in clouds. He began to adopt small rituals. At nightfall, he left a glass of water on the desk beside the letters. At dawn, he checked the level and sometimes swore it had changed, as if a part of it had been accepted. In the middle of the night, he lit a candle and traced the room's perimeter, the ring of light peeling from the dark details that would otherwise remain unseen. On rainy days, he sat on the main staircase, listening to the drumming on the roof, and felt that each drop rewrote the mansion's story in a language he was slowly learning to read. Gradually, the woman's figure he had seen in the garden ceased to be an isolated image. She didn't reappear with the clarity of that first day, but her presence seemed diffused through the architecture, like a scent one recognizes without ever seeing its source. At times, Paul was overtaken by a strange emotion, a will to protect something he couldn't define, an urge to ask forgiveness for a fault he couldn't remember committing. The feeling came with tenderness. It was as if he loved there, without a clear object, as if his body remembered another body and found in the rhythm of breath the gesture of an embrace that could never happen. The letters became the place of that embrace. In every reading, he found the counter shape of a presence. In every pause between paragraphs, the shadow of a hand that couldn't touch. The mansion reacted like a witness to a seed struggling to break through the soil. Light learned to rest on a precise spot of the desk at dusk, framing the pages in gold. Wind learned to enter, carrying the sound of birds that came from nowhere. There was a convergence. There was a calling. One cold, blue morning, Paul decided to explore the attic. He had passed that narrow hatch countless times without a trace of curiosity. But while putting the letters back into their box, he noticed something he had never seen before. The faded ribbon had, at one end, a tiny embroidery, no larger than a pinhead. It wasn't a clear drawing, just a weaving of pale lines. Still, something in him stirred at the sight. The embroidery repeated in miniature, the same figure carved into the handrail of the main staircase. Two intertwined serpents forming an incomplete circle. The image returned to him with almost painful speed. He remembered seeing it too in the corner of the ballroom, discreetly engraved into the baseboard and once more on an ornate hinge, hidden beneath a thick layer of paint. Each time the form appeared unfinished, as if waiting for the circle to be closed by a later hand. It was more than an ornament, it was an insistent sign, and it was also a summons, for Paul felt the impulse rising, to climb to the top of the house to find what was missing. The attic smelled of old straw and forgotten books. The air was lighter than he expected, as if the tiny windows breathed on their own. Dust hovered in thin layers, and mismatched furniture formed a landscape of survival. Crooked chairs, empty frames, lidless boxes. But in the center stood a low chest unlike the others, covered with a cloth that, despite the passing years, still carried a quiet dignity. On its clasp, once again, the intertwined serpents, and for the first time, the circle seemed almost complete, interrupted by less than a centimeter. The wood responded to his touch with a soft crack, and in that small surrender there was something intimate, the consent of a secret. Paul felt his heartbeat stumble as he lifted the fabric and traced the carved relief of the latch. The metal, cold, etched the scales with precision. A tiny flake of varnish broke loose and settled in his palm, glittering like a grain of salt. He lingered on the gesture because he understood, with the clarity of things that can never be unsaid, that any movement from that point on would alter the map of what he had learned to call reality. When he finally raised the lid, the scent of ancient paper rose like a gentle spirit. Inside, he found hand-bound notebooks, curled newspaper clippings, an empty photo frame, and a small darkened bronze key tied to the bottom with a pale ribbon. When freed, the metal left an imprint on the lining, an oval mark, perfect, like the negative of a sun. The key bore no inscription, yet its shape was unmistakably familiar to the house. And somewhere within his memory, without any tangible proof, Paul knew that this key was meant to close the circle. As he held it, the wind stirred the attic windows, and the slanted glow of late afternoon crossed the dust in slow procession. The particles shimmered, forming momentary constellations, and for one long breath the mansion seemed to hold only silence. Paul slipped the key into his pocket and, driven by an impulse without origin, descended toward the room of letters. The serpents carved into the handrail, glimpsed as he passed, seemed closer than ever. On the final step, a floorboard groaned with a different note, almost a sound of ascent. The desk was waiting, the light was waiting, but atop the box of letters, something new. A single page, undated, alone. The text was brief, almost unguarded, yet sharp in its unprotected sweetness. The words pointed to a specific place, the wooden panel behind the stopped clock in the east corridor. On that very wall, the house bore the engraving of the serpents. Then Paul saw it. The choreography of recent days made sense at last. The embroidery on the ribbon, the carved baseboard in the ballroom, the ornate hinge, the chest's latch, the bronze key. Everything led to the east corridor. Everything called for the panel. Everything called for courage. The mansion held its breath as he stood before the silent clock. Dust formed a thin skin across its face, and the frozen hands marked an hour that no longer existed. Feeling along the edges, Paul found a faint gap, the soft resistance of a forgotten mechanism. The wood yielded with an ancient sigh, and behind the panel revealed a tiny keyhole, delicate, exact, too precise to be chance. The key seemed to recognize it, as if returning to the place it had never truly left. He felt in his palms the tremor of something that resists definition, perhaps the nearness of fate. The metal touched the lock, and the cold cut through his skin like a single clear note. There was a muted click, a sound like relief. The panel quivered, pushed outward from within by a slow mechanism, and from the darkness of the opening came the scent of newly freed paper. Inside the compartment was a bundle of letters, different from the rest, sealed, untouched, bound with wax, where, at last, the serpent's circle closed completely. And beneath them lay a single photograph with no face, veiled by an opaque film, as if the image itself were waiting for the right moment to be born. Paul reached out his hand, and the entire house seemed to lean toward him, as one does when straining to listen. The silence that followed the opening of the panel was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of time, condensed. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, afraid to disturb the moment when the past would finally reveal itself. Paul kept his hand suspended, torn between impulse and hesitation, feeling the weight of the air pressing against his chest. The sealed letters lay there, resting with a serenity that defied their age. The wax seal, a darkened red, bore the image of two serpents intertwined. The circle finally closed, a symbol of return, of completion, of something that, even after death, refused to be forgotten. He touched the bundle with his fingertips. The paper responded like living skin, cold, sensitive. As he lifted the first letter, the dust in the air rose in tiny swirls, dancing around him as though the house were exhaling its own spirit. The candlelight flickered, casting the outline of his hand onto the wall, turning it into both shadow and gesture. There was a scent there different from the jasmine of the earlier letters, denser, recalling wax, wood, and old tears. Carefully, he broke the seal. The sound was faint, yet it echoed through the room like the crack of a decision. Inside, he found a thinner sheet of paper, almost translucent, the words written in blue ink, the strokes steady yet mournful. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. Ilara. The message began with a line that felt impossibly addressed to him. To the one who will find me when I am already a memory. For an instant, Paul felt the ground tilt, as though reality itself bent beneath his feet. He read slowly, absorbing each line with reverence. Ilara wrote of a promise made in the shadow of a fig tree, the same he had found in the courtyard. She spoke of a waiting that crossed generations, of a love interrupted by something she could no longer name. The final lines read, "When the serpents unite and the circle closes, the one who reads will see in me the mirror of himself. And when he looks upon the portrait, he will see what has always lived within his own face." Paul lifted his gaze to the veiled portrait. A wave of dizziness passed through him, a tremor in the air. The fabric that covered it seemed lighter now, as though breathing. He approached slowly, guided by an instinct made of equal parts curiosity and devotion. Each step echoed inside him, not just on the wooden floor but deeper in the inner space where mystery becomes faith. When he touched the cloth, a shiver crawled up his spine. The fabric was cold, yet pulsed faintly, as though warmth hid beneath the chill. He lifted the veil with a slow motion. Dust fell like snow, and the portrait was revealed. Or almost. The frame was intact, the glass spotless, but the painting was unfinished. The woman's body sat beneath the fig tree, her white dress as translucent as mist. The background was the same garden he saw from the window, but the face was missing. In its place, only a pale haze as if awaiting the trace of an unseen gaze. He stepped back, heart pounding. His mind searched for reason, but emotion moved faster. That absence was more disturbing than any apparition. It was as if the portrait knew it was incomplete. Then the light flickered again, and his reflection appeared in the glass. For a single instant, his face merged with the faceless image, and in the reflection, the serpents from the wax seal seemed to move, turning, tightening, closing in. Paul felt the same weight in the air that had followed him since his first day in the mansion. But now it was different. It was not the house watching him. It was the house remembering him. The past recognized him, absorbing him into a story that had waited too long to be finished. And in that moment he understood. The portrait, the letters, the house. They were all parts of the same entity. Everything was memory. And he was both its visitor and its heir. Ilara's words echoed in his mind like an ancient chant. Love does not end. It changes form. When Paul placed the veil back over the portrait, a sense of calm settled through the room. The candle's flame steadied, the wind fell silent, and the mansion seemed to breathe again. But beneath that serenity, something lingered. A quiet tension, a promise of revelation, an invitation to continue. That night, Paul dreamed once more. He dreamed of the fig tree alive, blooming beneath an impossible moonlight. He dreamed of footsteps ascending the stairs, of voices chanting in unison, a name that woke him before he could grasp its meaning. When he awoke, a new letter rested upon his pillow. No envelope, no seal, no date. Only a single line, written in firm, graceful handwriting. You still haven't remembered who you are. The letter bore no date, yet the weight of its words made time itself seem unnecessary. You still haven't remembered who you are." Paul read and reread the phrase until it became less thought than text, less text than pulse. The handwriting, elegant and curved, was the same as all the others, and though unsigned, her name, Ilara, seemed whispered between the invisible lines. The entire mansion listened as he read. The windows breathed slowly, the floor replied with faint cracks, and the wind drifting through the hallway carried a nearly human murmur. He spent the day in silence trying to understand. How could that letter have appeared there? No one else lived in the house, and the doors were always locked at night. And yet the letters kept appearing. Silent, precise, inevitable. The doubt that had once been fear began to turn into fascination. And fascination, slowly, into attachment. His routine changed. Each morning he checked the places where the letters tended to appear. The desk, the corridor, the pillow, the courtyard beneath the fig tree. Sometimes he found nothing, and the emptiness unsettled him. Other times, a new letter awaited, as if the house itself answered his unease with words written in secret. The messages grew more personal. They spoke of memories that weren't his, yet felt familiar, as though they had always belonged to him. Descriptions of gestures, of places, of a scent that lingered even when no one was near. One of them read, "I saw you in the ballroom mirror. You were younger, and yet the same. There was in your eyes the weariness of someone searching for his own reflection. When I looked at you, I recognized what time had tried to erase. It was us once again." Those words left him suspended in a silence too deep for reason. He began to doubt his own chronology. The borders between dream and waking, past and present, grew porous. Sometimes, while walking the corridors, he felt the brush of fabric against the floor, the faint displacement of air as though someone preceded him by a single step. Other times, his reflection in the glass seemed to lag behind, half a second late, like another presence trying to follow but slightly out of rhythm with reality. At night, the dreams became clearer, no longer fragments but complete scenes, saturated with emotion. He dreamed of a ball in the mansion, candles lit, music distant and slow. The guests moved in graceful turns, their faces indistinct. But she, Ilara, shone at the center of it all. She wore the same white as the letters, her hair tied with a silver ribbon. And in her eyes, his reflection, younger, smiling, dancing, loving. In one of those dreams, she offered him a blue rose. He reached for it, but before he could touch, the flower dissolved into luminous ashes, and the music stopped. When he awoke, a single blue petal lay upon the sheets, not paper, not illusion. A real petal, cold and damp as though freshly cut. From that day on, Paul accepted the impossible. The house was not merely a vessel of memory, it was a mirror between worlds. And he, without knowing, had become part of the story he sought to decipher. He began keeping a journal, recording every detail, the letters, the dreams, the shifts in the air, the way sunlight entered through different windows at different hours. But one night, while rereading his notes, he noticed something unsettling. The earliest pages were not in his handwriting. They were his, yes, but written differently, more elegant, older, identical to hers. The words he thought he had written were, in truth, replies. The revelation struck him like a silent vertigo. Perhaps he had not merely been reading her letters. Perhaps he had been continuing them. Perhaps they had always been written with four hands, across centuries, she from the other side of time, he from this one unaware. That night rain fell hard. The storm drummed against the stained glass in a melody that felt almost sorrowful. The mansion trembled with faint sighs, and each flash of lightning briefly awakened the portraits along the corridor. Unable to sleep, Paul lit a candle and approached the veiled portrait. This time the fabric seemed to move on its own. He pulled it away, and what he saw made him step back. The missing face was no longer empty. Something had begun to form. Contours, shadows, the faint suggestion of an expression, the beginning of an eye, the ghost of a smile. It wasn't complete, but enough to recognize. It was his face. Paul fell to his knees, the candle trembling in his hand. The impossible stood before him. He was part of the painting. Or perhaps he always had been. The flame quivered, casting their shadows together upon the wall, his and hers, intertwined by light. And in that instant, a whisper coursed through the house, flowing from every corridor, every breath of air, sweet, distant, timeless. Now you begin to remember. For hours, Paul remained kneeling before the portrait, his gaze lost between paint and reflection, the two faces blending beneath the glass. The image was still incomplete, but every new line seemed to emerge from within him, as though the painting was drawing him back, stroke by stroke, with the very essence of his being. It was as if each letter read, each dream dreamed, each memory revived, served as pigment to complete what had been left unfinished. When dawn tinted the windows gray, he realized he hadn't slept. And yet, he felt more awake than ever, as if he had just awakened from a lifetime of forgetting. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. Everything that mattered was contained within the walls of that house. The air he breathed, the silent voices, the shadows that watched him tenderly. He decided then to revisit every corner of the mansion, not to explore, but to understand. He began with the basement, where the air was thick and the ground coated in a thin layer of dust. He found broken furniture, stacked frames, fragments of old portraits, pieces of faces staring back at him with the melancholy of the forgotten. In one corner, a small iron door caught his attention. The latch resisted but finally gave way. Behind it, a narrow compartment, like a built-in cabinet. Inside, a pile of boxes tied with dark ribbons. He opened them and found more letters. But these were different. The edges were burned, some stained with dried blood. The seals bore strange symbols: flames, eyes, wings, marks belonging to a time older than the house itself. The first letters spoke of persecution, of forbidden love, of someone writing in haste, fleeing from something that couldn't be named. A partial signature, E.D., Elara Duarte. Paul's heart clenched. The surname was the same as the family who had owned the mansion. These letters belonged to her, but their tone was different. Desperate, urgent, fearful. One read, "They've found out. What we've lived will not be forgiven. There are eyes in every mirror and voices in the walls. I promise I will wait, even if time must bend, even if death must learn to love again." Paul's hands trembled. The words felt familiar, as if written from a fragment of his own memory. With each letter, the story deepened. Elara and a man, a painter, had loved each other in secret. A love condemned by her family, who saw him as an intruder, a commoner, unworthy. When the scandal broke, the painter vanished. Some said he was banished. Others whispered he had taken his own life in the gardens. Elara, consumed by grief, lived in seclusion until her death. Some said she went mad, writing letters that were never sent, waiting for a return that never came. Paul dropped the last page and drew a trembling breath. The floor seemed to quake, and an ancient recognition enveloped him. The painter. He saw him, for a flicker of a second, hands covered in pigment, eyes lost before a canvas, the same face that now stared back from the mirror. It wasn't an imagined memory. It was his. The truth rose like a whisper from across centuries. He was the painter, or rather, he had been. The soul that now inhabited his body had once lived there, loved there, died there. And somewhere in the invisible folds of time, Elara was still waiting. Dazed, he ran up the stairs, heart pounding like thunder. When he reached the ballroom, the portrait awaited him. Something had changed again. The faces were now complete. Not only his, but hers. Two visages fused upon the same canvas, entwined as if love itself had abolished the distance between flesh and spirit. Paul stepped closer and saw that the painting was alive. The colors pulsed. The air seemed to move. There was emotion in the paint, sorrow, tenderness, remembrance. and in the bottom corner a signature, E&A, 1892. He understood. Elara and he had painted together. The portrait was their vow, a pact sealed with art and blood, a promise of reunion beyond time. As he stared at the painting, a distant sound reached his ears, a piano playing far away, soft, ancient notes echoing through the empty corridor. He followed the melody to the grand hall, where the instrument, covered in dust, was now playing by itself. The keys moved gently, and the sound drifted through the air like a memory refusing to die. He sat before the piano, resting his hands on the keys. When he played, a force greater than himself guided him. It was not just music, it was remembrance, given shape by sound. And as he played, a woman's voice, soft and distant, whispered in his mind, "Now, you remember me." The air shifted. The hall, once faded, began to regain color. The curtains moved, the candles relit, the mirrors caught the returning light. And among the shadows, she appeared, not as a ghost, but as presence. Elara stood there, as alive as the jasmine scent that filled the room. She did not look at him. She looked through him, as one who sees the past and the present folded together. And Paul understood, silently, that this reunion was not meant to possess but to remember. They were echoes of each other. Two halves of a promise time had failed to break. The piano fell silent. She smiled, and whispered, as one who seals a farewell, "We have completed the circle." The house sighed, the wind ceased, and everything grew still. By morning, when sunlight filtered through the stained glass, the mansion had changed, serene, cleansed, lighter. The letters were gone, the portrait too. Only a single blue petal rested upon the piano, bearing a handwritten line, "To the one who found me again." Paul smiled, for the first time in a long while. He knew that love had not ended. It had simply changed form. As he left the house without looking back, he saw the gate standing open, as if the mansion had finally granted him freedom. But as he crossed the road and looked toward the horizon, something made him stop. Between the tall windows of the mansion, a shadow watched him, a feminine silhouette, still serene, and the scent of jasmine swept through the wind. For a brief moment, Paul believed it was over. The morning air, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the distant sound of the sea, everything felt like an ending, peace earned after chaos. The mansion stood behind him, and for the first time since arriving, the invisible weight that followed him seemed to dissolve into the breeze. But one single step was enough for silence to call him back. The sound that stopped him wasn't noise, not wind nor creak nor voice. It was something deeper, a sensation. The kind born in the center of the chest, spreading outward like an ancient warmth. It was as if the house, watching him leave, spoke his name without sound, calling him from within. And with it came a question. Had the circle truly closed? Paul looked back again. The mansion, smaller in the distance, was no less alive. Its windows reflected the sun strangely, not like glass but like eyes. The shadows between the columns moved with the rhythm of breathing. He knew he should keep walking. Perhaps destiny wanted to free him. But something deeper than reason or fear refused to let go. He turned back. Each step against the road defied logic, yet obeyed a greater impulse. Silent, inevitable. When he reached the gate, the rust seemed to recognize him. The iron groaned open without resistance, welcoming an expected guest. Crossing the garden, he noticed the ivy had changed color, the dark green now a silvery gray, as if reflecting light from another world. The statues stood still yet softer, serene, surrendered. The house was waiting, and within it, something, or someone, waited for the story's final closing. Inside, the air wrapped around him like an old memory. The scent of jasmine returned, now mixed with another, the faint trace of burnt wood, like the last breath of a dying candle. The clock in the east corridor, once stopped, now marked an hour, 7 past 7. The hands aligned perfectly. a symbol of reunion. He followed the corridor, guided by the faintest sound of footsteps. As he advanced, the world around him began to change texture. The dust dissolved, the walls gleamed, the mirrors cleared themselves. The mansion, renewed, alive, pulsing, breathed once again in his presence. Time curved around him, each moment both memory and now. In the grand hall, the piano stood open again. Upon it, the blue pedal was gone. In its place rested a new object, a dark-covered journal, identical to his own. When he opened it, the pages were filled, but not in his handwriting. It was Ilara's. On the first page, a dedication. To the one who has not yet understood the price of a love that defies time. The pages that followed told what he did not yet know. Ilara wrote of what had happened after her death, how she had wandered the mansion unable to leave, bound by the weight of the promise. How time had folded, drawing his soul back to her, reborn in another body, in another era, but always marked by the same longing. She described the waiting, the repetition of days, the writing of the letters he now read, and then the tone shifted, darker, colder. But the circle only closes when one of us chooses to forget. Paul's stomach tightened. Forget? Was that the price? Would he have to renounce remembrance, to free them both? The wind blew through the windows, extinguishing the candles, and for a moment everything was dark. Then a voice whispered, soft, clear, from within the hall, "If you stay, it will all begin again." He turned. Ilara was there. But this time not ethereal, sharp, real, almost human. Her white dress seemed stitched from light. Her hair unbound, danced in an invisible wind. Her gaze was serene sadness, the kind that understands even as it loves. "Why did you call me back?" he asked in thought, for no sound would come. And she, without moving her lips, answered in his mind, "Because love, when left unforgiven, repeats itself. And I can't wait anymore." The ground beneath his feet began to tremble lightly. The walls seemed to breathe. The frames quivered, and somewhere above the portrait cracked, the glass splintering from within. Paul felt a deep ache, not physical, but emotional, ancient. Every memory of them, every life unlived, rose all at once inside him. Ilara reached out her hand. Between them the air rippled, like sunlight on water. He stepped forward, and everything solid, floor, wall, time, began to dissolve. For an instant, he was inside the painting, alive within it, beside her. The garden bloomed around them. The piano's sound enveloped the air. The world hung suspended between the real and the dream. But then the phrase from the journal returned to him. One of us must forget. And he understood. Their love would only end if one of them surrendered remembrance, so the other could be free. He looked at her one last time and smiled, the smile of someone who loves enough to let go. Ilara understood. Her expression softened, her eyes turned weightless. The wind rose, swirling. Her image began to fade into light, and with her final whisper she said, "Thank you for remembering, so I could forget." The hall fell silent, the piano stilled. The house at last went to sleep. Paul fell to his knees, warm tears streaming, not of sorrow but release. Love, after all, had not ended. It had found rest. When the morning sun touched the ballroom floor, he realized he was alone. The portrait was gone, the journal too, and where Ilara had stood, a faint shadow remained on the floor, like a seal, like a signature. The serpents intertwined, the circle complete, and Paul understood with the calm of those who finally see. He had not found the letters, and the letters had found him to remind him of what needed to be forgotten. When silence fully settled, Paul believed he could finally leave. The air felt pure. The sunlight passed gently through the stained glass, and the mansion, for the first time, no longer pressed upon him. It was as though the house had blessed him, granting closure to the cycle. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let his body surrender to exhaustion. The distant murmur of the sea returned, soft, steady, like the heartbeat of a soul at peace. But time, ever capricious, still held one final gesture. When he opened his eyes, something was wrong. The sun, once bathing the hall, no longer moved. The golden beam hung motionless between the columns, as though time itself had stopped breathing. The dust in the air stood still. No birds sang. Reality was holding its breath. Then a subtle tremor ran through the floor. Light at first, then stronger. The mirrors along the walls shivered, and the portraits, once empty, began to change. Faces emerged and vanished in succession. Generations of people, of loves, of promises, of unfinished stories. The house was showing its own memory, the sum of everything that had never been forgotten. Paul rose to his feet. The air grew heavy again, not with fear, but with truth. A truth that called to him from inside his very body. He walked down the corridor, watching the faces appear and fade. Each one carried a fragment of himself, a gaze, a gesture, the same soul reflected in different forms. Then he understood. It had never been just him and Alara. There had been many. Their love had crossed existences, repeated faces, rewritten fates. The mansion was the convergence point of them all, the dwelling of the echo, the place where stories came to remember themselves. The ground trembled again, and at the end of the corridor a door appeared, one that had never been there before. Tall, dark wood, adorned with carvings of intertwined serpents, the circle now fully closed. Curiously, the lock held no key. It waited for a different kind of gesture. Paul stepped closer. As his hand touched the wood, warmth flowed into his palm. The symbol glowed softly, and a voice, not from the air but from within him, spoke. You no longer belong to time, but you belong to memory, and in memory, truth rests. The door opened. Beyond it there was no room, no staircase, no ceiling, only a vast expanse of golden mist crossed by drifting lights. It was like stepping into a living dream. Shapes dissolved, contours wavered, and at the center, a figure awaited him. Ilara, but she was no longer the woman of the letters or the portrait. She was made of light and shadow, of memory and forgetting, a painting that breathed. Her eyes held every life they had shared, and as he saw her, he felt that words could never suffice. She smiled, a smile containing all ages, and the space around them began to pulse, each heartbeat a memory reborn. The first touch, the first promise, the first farewell, all of it there concentrated in a single moment, as if time itself had only ever been a disguise. Ilara reached out her hand. He stepped forward, and the ground beneath his feet ceased to exist. There was no more weight, no body, no floor, only light and sound. When their hands touched, the world unfolded. The walls of the mansion vanished, leaving behind an expanse made of memories. The house was theirs now, each room a fragment of what they had lived. The garden, the hall, the piano, the fig tree. Everything spun around them, dissolving into light, until only the two of them remained. Do you understand now? Her voice asked, not with words, but with feeling. And he did. The mansion was not a place. It was her heart. Each letter was a heartbeat, each room a guarded memory. And he, in returning, had not come to explore a house of wood and stone, but a dwelling of the soul, the refuge where love waited to be set free. The truth was both simple and terrible. She could only depart once he found her and forgave her for making him wait. And he could only move forward once he accepted that their love no longer needed memory to exist. Ilara drew close, their faces almost touching, and the light around them turned blinding white. Now, she said, it's time to return to where time still exists. A sound like shattering glass echoed. The mist dissolved. Paul awoke. He lay on the ballroom floor, his head resting upon the dark-covered journal. The piano was closed, the windows open. The late afternoon sun filled the room with a soft orange glow. The mansion seemed asleep, content, as though a prayer had been completed. He rose slowly. The letters were gone. Where the portrait had hung, there was only a smooth wall, but in the light, an inscription appeared, faintly carved. "Here ends what never ended." The words seemed to breathe, and with them came the final understanding. Their story had not ended in death nor in forgetting. It ended in forgiveness. He walked to the front door. The air outside was new, almost sweet. The trees looked alive again, the horizon nearer. As he crossed the gate, the wind blew, carrying Jasmine. For an instant, he thought he heard a soft laugh dissolving into the sound of the sea. And for the first time, he felt free. Not because he had forgotten, but because he remembered without pain. Memory was no longer a prison. It had become a home. Walking down the road, he turned once. The mansion stood silent and beautiful, windows open, curtains dancing. It seemed to breathe peace. And in the reflection of the last ray of sunlight, he swore he saw two figures, walking hand in hand, smiling. He understood then, true love never belongs to time. It only changes form and continues. Always. Without hurry, Paul walked toward the nearest town. The dirt road seemed different, lighter, as though even the ground welcomed him. Each step was a gesture of farewell. Behind him, the mansion's silence faded into distance, becoming the soft murmur of a dream. And yet the sense of presence lingered, gentle, sweet, like the echo of a beloved voice at the edge of memory. In the days that followed, he tried to return to ordinary life. He stayed at an inn, bought new clothes, listened to the mundane sounds of conversation, birds and bells. But something within him had changed. Time no longer carried the same weight. The hours felt light, transparent. He noticed what others missed: the whisper of wind through leaves, the shimmer of light across surfaces, the warmth of an old memory that no longer hurt. One morning upon waking, he found a notebook on the table. He did not remember leaving it there. Its cover was dark leather, and on its center, the seal of the intertwined serpents, now completely joined. He opened it with trembling hands. The first pages bore his own handwriting, recent notes, descriptions of the mansion, records of dreams. But as he turned the pages, the script shifted, gently, gracefully, until it became hers, Ilara. The next pages were not a story, but fragments of thought, scattered reflections written across time. Love is the way eternity experiences an instant. Death does not separate. It only changes the direction of the gaze. When someone remembers us with tenderness, we live again. He read each line with reverence, feeling her presence in every word. The notebook pulsed warmly under his touch, as if it breathed. And on the final page there was no text, only the imprint of a single blue petal, pressed between the paper and the cover, the flower she had given him in a dream, long ago. Beneath the mark, a short line written in silver ink: "Now you remember me without holding me." Paul closed the notebook and, for the first time, smiled without sorrow. Life, he realized, was made not only of moments lived, but of memories released. To love was to let something continue, even after oneself. Like a house that stands, long after all its dwellers have gone. In the months that followed, he wrote, not about ghosts or hauntings, but about love and memory, about how time bends when feeling is true. The words came easily, as if whispered by a distant voice. And every time he closed the notebook, the scent of jasmine returned, gentle, affirming that she was still there, not as shadow, but as light. One evening, walking by the sea, he saw a heron land upon a rock. The setting sun painted the sky in rose and gold, and for a moment everything felt suspended. The horizon blurred into the reflection of the water, and the rhythm of the waves was that of a quiet heartbeat. He closed his eyes and felt a hand rest upon his own. No surprise, no fear, only recognition. Her voice, soft, distant, said what he had always known. "You have fulfilled what you promised, and I can finally rest." When he opened his eyes, the heron was gone, and the wind blew gently toward the mansion. He stood there for a while, watching until the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. And he understood. Their love no longer belonged to walls or letters or memory. It lived in what remained, in the act of remembering lightly, in the gift of moving on in peace. That night, as he slept, he dreamed of a field of blue flowers. The wind moved softly, and far away, a house shone beneath the moonlight. At the window, a woman smiled, and for the first time in every dream, she was not waiting. She was simply watching, free. Paul awoke with quiet tears and a peaceful smile. The notebook rested open upon his chest. On the last page, once blank, a new line had appeared, written in firm, familiar hand. "Love does not end, it changes form, and it lives on, always, in those who remember without fear." He closed the notebook, looked out the window and saw the first light of morning rise. The world now seemed vast and light, as though every stone and leaf carried a secret soul. And as the sun broke the horizon, he whispered, not to the wind but to the silence, "Until we meet again, Ilara." The scent of jasmine answered, and then silence, sweet, complete, eternal.